right, thank you everybody for coming. It's maybe one of my first pandemic in-person talks. So I'm really happy that Colin Allen has come to give the first or second CogSci lecture of this academic year. Colin is a distinguished professor in the Department of the History and Philosophy of Science at the University of Pittsburgh and a fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, the AAAS, recipient of the Humboldt Research Award, and associate editor of the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, which sounds like a lot of work. His main areas of research are the philosophical foundations of cognitive science, and he's also interested in scientific study of cognition, both in non-human animals and in machines. So he's gotten into philosophy of AI. He's also the director of the Internet Philosophy Ontology Project and co-founder of a project on the evolution of human cognition that was funded by the John Templeton Foundation. And there's more to say, but I guess I'll just say that I have known him since I was a graduate student and really admired his work ever since then. And so it's really a great pleasure to have him here. So thank you for coming under weird conditions.
Yeah. Right. Well, thanks, Adina. It's a good thing I'm wearing a mask because you'd see me blushing otherwise. Maybe you do anyway. But yeah, and also most of that stuff, winning awards, that's not work. And the encyclopedia is run day to day by other people. I just get to swan in occasionally and give my opinions on things. But giving a talk in a pandemic is a bit more work, but I'm really happy to be in person because I think a lot of us have just been tired of being online. So I'm going to try to lay out what I'm calling here a neurofunctional account of suffering. And this work is motivated by various things, including my interest in cycling. For those of you who know cycling, you probably recognize this as the infamous Paris-Roubaix race, also known as the Hell of the North, sort of the premier one-day professional bicycle race in the late spring. It's in the northwest corner of France, very close to Belgium, lots of cobbles, lots of mud, lots of rain. You know, it's a very tough race. There's actually some really great movies about it, and this is George Hincapie in the front, who never won it. He got to second in 1 year and was in the top 10 multiple times, but never quite got to the first step of the podium. So I'm motivated both sort of as not a professional, but a sort of a keen cyclist, and sort of what actually is going on in these kinds of circumstances. But also part of the motivation for this talk comes from work that I've done thinking about pain in animals, and that edges into ethical questions about animals, questions that I think are often above my pay grade, but the ethics questions, that is, but the kinds of cognitive science questions about what we can say about the systems that underlie pain are really interesting. I find that something that I will spend quite a time thinking about. And I'm going today sort of to try to tease apart. You might think, well, suffering is just a lot of pain, right? You might think that it's just on some continuum here, but I'm going to try and tease apart these notions for various reasons. And in doing so, I want to ground that account in some behavioral work that I think is replicable. You never know with psychology experiments these days. And some speculative ideas, perhaps, about what the functions of the neuroanatomy that underlie some of the behaviors that are seen. And I'm going to touch briefly on a little controversy, maybe that Tor is involved here. But generally give a systems level account of what's going on. So I'm not going to try and localize suffering in some part of the brain. I want to understand how the kind of dynamic interaction between different regions of the brain under certain conditions might underlie suffering. And it's that sense of functional, where if we understand what the components are contributing in these different configurations, then we have a better handle, I think, on thinking about how these kinds of psychological concepts can relate to the underlying neuroscience. And it's not, for those of you with philosophy backgrounds, you've heard of functionalism, which is sort of a view about the metaphysics of mind. I'm not doing that, right? I'm not sort of trying to argue that functionalism is the right view. I'm just trying to argue that the right explanatory strategy is one that takes into account the role of different parts of the system for then capacities at the level of the system. And hopefully out of that arises something that's suitable for empirical investigation, both in humans and non-human animals. And I'm not going to defend the claim that animals are basically conscious or sentient. That's sort of just taken for granted here. But what makes suffering happen is the real question here. And although I'm going to say some things, it's like I'm going to say this account is good because it matches some ideas that we might have about what suffering is pre-theoretically. I'm not trying to, I think that's the term is a very has many meanings, it's polysemic, and I'm not trying to analyze how the folk use the term. I'm trying to actually come up with something that's a bit more close to the science of the brain and behavior. So in that vein then, what to expect from this kind of account is more of a working hypothesis and a definition. I'm not coming in to define suffering for you. I'm just trying to capture some aspects of something that's reasonably called suffering. I want to go beyond sort of simple neural correlates, as I've said, to identify these system level kind of dynamical interactions among multifunctional components, and that, as I will argue later, involve a kind of agency towards adaptively coping with unpleasant situations. Right? So there are strategies that organisms can use to reduce negative affect, but when those strategies are failing, that's when suffering, I'm going to argue, comes into play. Right? So also, just to put this in the animal ethics context, anybody who's ever taken a course that's dealt with animal ethics knows that Jeremy Bentham, founder of the school of ethics known as utilitarianism, said the question about animals is not can they reason or can they talk, but can they suffer? So he puts suffering right at the center of his account there. These are just some Google numbers. I've been sort of tracking over the years, the increasing, 15,000, 16,000, 27,000 just yesterday, instances of that exact quote on the web. So this is just all over the place once you start getting into this kind of literature. But it's important to get some terminology down and then use that as a background then for trying to make sense of this notion of suffering. So a couple of important terms, obviously a nociception. So nociception just means reception of noxious stimuli. So sensory detection of potentially harmful stimuli. It was controversial even up to about 20 years ago about whether fish had nociceptors at all, right? But that's pretty much settled now. So this is a paper from 2003 by Lynn Snedden and others, Vicky Braithwaite, sort of identifying specific neural receptors for noxious stimuli in the head of a trout in this case. But that's not taken to be generative of any kind of sentient form of pain. In fact, if you take mammals, for instance, and you spinally transect them so that no signals are going from the lower spinal cord to the brain, the nociceptors still will work to produce reflex responses through the spinal cord. And at least I'm going to take for granted that the spinal cord is not itself a conscious or sentient system. So nociception itself, the mere fact that an organism is responsive to noxious stimuli, is not generally taken to be evidence directly that it has pain or sufficient evidence alone. So pain in the physical bodily sense is defined in various terms, and if I were giving a talk on animal pain, I would go into those definitions a bit more, but it's, broadly we'll just treat it here as an unpleasant sensation that's associated with nociception. And there's a lot of theorizing about pain, sort of older view that's still there, but it's a very abstract sort of first pass approximation is there's basically sensory pathways and there are affective pathways in the pain system in the central nervous system to the brain, and you can selectively disable either the sensory part, which tells the organism where this bad thing is happening, or the affective part, which you might think of as telling it, how unpleasant it is. And so I'll say a bit more about this later, but this ability to separate these things in various kinds of clinical ways actually counters some philosophical intuitions that you couldn't be in pain but not find it unpleasant. So many philosophers want to treat pain as essentially unpleasant. I'm not buying into that because I think the neuroscience doesn't really support that particular claim, although that's, again, not my goal here. We also have, in ordinary language, the notion of emotional pain, but one of the things that's interesting about certain kinds of unpleasant experiences that are associated, say, with grief or with social ostracism and so on, rely on some of the same systems that bodily or physical pain does, right? So I think even though this looks like a kind of metaphorical extension of the term, there's some underlying things one can say about why it's reasonable to treat these together. So then the question is, well, what is suffering? I already suggested that. On one view, it's just a high level of something unpleasant, some kind of physical or emotional pain, perhaps, right, or grief. But the view that I'm going to try and put forward is that it's actually more complicated than that. But before we get to that, this is, again, relatively recent. This is Popular Press, or Smithsonian Magazine at least. This sort of question of whether fish merely have nociception but actually have sentient experience of these unpleasant stimuli is still quite an active area of research, and I'm not going to talk about that, but I just wanted to say that there's sort of a push towards increasing the span of application of these terms. So given Bentham's, what matters is that they suffer. What do people working in this general space of animal ethics and animal welfare say about it? So I'm going to take two examples here. One's a philosopher, David DeGrazia. Another is we'll see a scientist in just a moment. So DeGrazia writes, in trying to explain what suffering is, that his aim is to clarify a concept whose meaning may be unclear because of the varying uses of the term. So it has multiple uses. And he identifies two main uses of this term in the literature. What he calls a broad construal, which is any instance of feeling bad that is more than mild. So that's the sort of continuum, right? There's pain or something that's unpleasant, and the things that are low on the scale are not really a suffering, but when they're high on the scale, they are. But then he also introduces this narrow construal where it's a bad feeling that is intense and attributable to the subject as opposed to a body part and more emotional than sensory. So what he's getting at there is you can say that you have a pain in your finger or your hand. You wouldn't say your hand is suffering. You're suffering, right? And so this is a property of the entire system, right? The pain is something more localizable in many cases. And because of what I explained before, where the sort of standard story of pain is that there's this sensory, where's it located dimension, and this affective, how bad is it dimension, this reference to being more emotional than sensory is him picking up on that affective pathway, right? The part of it that is not purely sensory. And that's basically going to be a system level property again. Meanwhile, Marion Stamp Dawkins is extremely well known in the science of animal welfare, takes a very different tack. After actually many years of trying to sort of operationalize notions having to do with these kind of internal felt states, she tacks in a different direction here and says, whatever anybody says, I feel that the hard problem of consciousness is still very hard. And to try and rest your ethical case on proving something that's baffled people for years seems to be not good for animals. Much better to say, let's go for something tangible, something we can measure. and I'm not going to read the rest of that quote because I've got more here, where what she says is this can be defined, this notion of suffering that she's interested in, as a set of negative emotions such as fear, pain, and boredom, and recognized operationally as states caused by negative reinforcers. I think she actually means either negative reinforcers or punishment, right? Because you'll see in a moment if you understand that distinction. If you don't worry about it. She says it may or may not be accompanied by subjective experiences similar to our own. The use of positive and negative reinforcers, which she glosses as what animals want and what animals do not want, that's a punishment. You don't want to be hit, right? A negative reinforcer technically is the removal of something that you do want. You want to be watching television, I'm going to turn it off, and that's a form of feedback. It's a negative reinforcer. But setting that aside, obviously sort of very behavioristic sort of account here, but together with basic measures of animal health, this, she says, provides a two-question framework for animal welfare science. I thought I'd got my 2 questions here, but that's back here, so something went wrong with that slide. But are the animals healthy? Do they have what they want? Right? Those are the 2 questions that she cares about. Right? If you can show that, she says, that's a much, much better basis for making your decisions. So if we look at these 2 accounts, and then I'm going to set mine up, Dawkins is saying, well, look, pain is really a subtype of suffering. It's one kind of thing that a state that you don't want to be in, right? And she's just going to stipulate that that's how we're going to use the term suffering, and any link to consciousness is just then put out of the box, so to speak. De Grazia, as we saw, says it's any bad feeling that's intense, and so in the narrow construal, there's further qualification of that, right? In the broad view, it's just a high-level negative affect. He's taking consciousness for granted here. And me, at least today, my view is going to be, well, pain is one among many potential causes of suffering. There may be others. Fear of losing the bicycle race could be one of them, right? My approach here then is this kind of empirically theorized conceptual engineering. So I don't really care about explaining how people use the term suffering. What I want is a notion of suffering that distinguishes it from pain and makes it distinguishable in empirical terms, and that is makes suffering something that's probably in the paradigm case is going to be conscious, but the exact relationship of that is TBD in some sense, to be determined. All right, so to some of the literature. So some of you may be familiar with Kahneman's work on what's known as the peak end rule. Also comes under his heuristics approach as the affect heuristic. And I'm going to tell you about a couple of experiments that are in play here. So one is in the lab, they had subjects hold their hand for 60 seconds at 14 Celsius, which is about 56 Fahrenheit. It's cold, unpleasantly cold if you have to hold your hand in there for a minute. And then for another 30 seconds, unbeknownst to the subjects, the temperature was raised by just 1 degree, so up to about 58, all right? Versus subjects who just got the 60 plus 14 treatment, right? And then asked them after this, would you be willing to go through it again? The people who had this treatment are more willing to go through the treatment than this one, all right? So it looks like more unpleasantness is actually preferable to less unpleasantness from this result. And this is not just a lab phenomenon. So he actually did a study with colonoscopy patients who, for whatever reason, were not having this done under anesthetic. It was the 90s, I guess. There were people who were in for a colonoscopy, and they were asked every minute on a scale of 0 to 10, how bad is it right now, right? And at the end of it, they were asked, how awful was the whole thing? So they were asked to give a global evaluation at the end, and then these 1-minute intervals. So this is sample data from 2 participants. So this person's colonoscopy went about 9 minutes. This person's went about 25 minutes. You can see that at the peak, they're very much the same. But what they find is that people with profiles like this find it much less bad overall than this, even in cases where the procedure lasts as much as an hour or more, right? So again, more pain, right, seems like something not as bad. So just to quote from the paper, the correlation of global evaluations with the duration of the procedure, which ranged from 4 to 66 minutes, was 0.03, right? So very, very little correlation with the actual length of time that they were in this procedure. On the other hand, global evaluations were correlated 0.67 with an average of the pain reported on 2 occasions, when the pain was at its peak and where it was just before the procedure ended, right? So just before it's ended, this patient is way down here, right? Whereas this patient is very close to the peak just before it ends. This patient's going to rate the whole thing much worse than this one. So it could be a memory effect. There's all kinds of possible explanations you could come up for this, and I'm not really so much interested in that at the moment. What I'm most interested in is just sort of putting out this puzzling phenomenon that more pain somehow doesn't seem like more suffering when assessed very close to the end of the procedure. I don't think I'll go into this very much, but this is some work. I tend to be quite interested in the work that Coghill and his group do here, but in particular here, the idea is that very small decreases in noxious stimulus temperatures evoke changes in perceived pain intensity that were as much as nearly 300% greater than those of equal magnitude increases. So the decreases, right, are really key here in the sort of overall objective evaluation, subjective evaluation. These decreases in perceived pain intensity were sufficiently large to be indistinguishable from those evoked by 15 Celsius decreases to clearly innocuous levels. So just a little bit of reduction still within the pain gives you as much sense that this ain't so bad as a big reduction down to something that you would not have found bad at all, right? So these are sort of puzzling results, right? Why is this decrease here so salient, and why is a big drop-off at the end of a procedure versus a small drop-off at the end of a much longer procedure going to give you different outcomes in terms of the overall evaluation? So if we start getting into the sort of neural aspects of this in a bit more detail, and I realize that we've got an expert in the room here, so I'm very, very happy to kind of be corrected on where the latest thinking on this. But this is again another report from the Coghill lab, in which they specifically look at variation in individual sensitivity to pain. So some people seem to be very sensitive to painful stimuli, others not so sensitive, and they try to sort of tease apart what's going on that's different between these two. And what they find is that highly sensitive individuals exhibited more frequent, more robust pain-induced activation of primary somatosensory cortex. That's the sensory pathway for pain, anterior cingulate cortex, and prefrontal cortex. Now, again, I'm no expert on the anatomy, and I know that anterior cingulate cortex is, technically speaking, part of prefrontal cortex, so they're meaning areas of prefrontal even further forward than the anterior cingulate. And from my earlier work on animal pain, having done a couple of papers quite a bit before this one, I was working with some people who studied these kinds of systems in rodents, and for them, the rodent equivalent of the ACC turns out to be very important for this affective aspect of pain, and I'll have a bit more to say about that. So for those of you who don't know, roughly this yellowish area here is anterior cingulate cortex. It's a sub-region of medial prefrontal cortex, so that puts it in the prefrontal cortex, and it seems to be involved in unpleasantness ratings of pain. It's a dense site of opioid receptors, so that's where morphine, why it's good to give you morphine. It has a huge effect on anterior cingulate. And in the rodent studies, for instance, if you give morphine or you do a surgical ablation of this region in the rodent brain, what you get, this is just a bunch of jargon, it affects place preference conditioning in rats. So given a rat that's not on morphine and let's say getting shocked in one part of a chamber but can move to another part of the chamber where it's not getting shocked, it will very rapidly learn to go to the place where it's not getting shocked. Given a moderate to low dose of morphine where it's still showing a reflex withdrawal from the shock, those rats won't bother change location, right? So we know that the sensory pathway is working at least through the spinal cord, but it somehow doesn't seem to bother them. And this is consistent with reports from patients on morphine who will say things to doctors like, well, the pain's still there, but it doesn't bother me anymore, all right? Which again, from a kind of a priori conceptual, pain is essentially bothersome, makes no sense whatsoever, but this is a very common report of patients who are given morphine. We also, I believe, know, but you know, these things are always subject to change, that the ACC, the anterior cingulate cortex, is involved in effortful learning and problem solving. So when you're learning a new task, solving a problem, a lot of activity in the anterior cingulate cortex. So again, I want to emphasize that the view here is not that any particular piece of psychology can be stuck in one piece of the brain and it's only doing that one thing and it's the only place where that one thing has happened. It's part of a much larger system where these components play different roles perhaps at different times, but we have at least that association there. And it also seems to be really important in acquiring cognitive control of behavior. So one thing that's interesting, I'll refer briefly at the end, but let me mention it now. There have been studies on experienced or learning meditators. Many of this comes out of sort of tradition of working with Buddhist monks in fMRI, where novice meditators are showing high levels of ACC activity, whereas experienced meditators are not, right? And I'm just mentioning that because it'll sort of set up the basic structure of the account I want to give, which is that the ACC, I'm going to suggest, can be thought as, crudely speaking, as a kind of plan evaluator. It's part of the learning system that's figuring out, learning whether or not what you're doing is accomplishing anything. And more frontal parts of the prefrontal cortex are sort of basically planning, you know, throwing out ideas, if you like, just to anthropomorphize it, right? That are part then of this system where there's a back and forth between try this, that's not going to work, try this, that's not going to work. And one way you could think about the general story I'm telling you here, there's kind of a potential here for what computer scientists would call a race condition, right? So a race condition is when one part of the system makes a demand on the other part of the system, and that system's response increases the level of demand from the other one, and you're off into a positive feedback loop. So the claim would be that what's going on in these cases, that you've got something akin to a race condition going on here. But if you're on morphine, you're dampening this. So you break that, right? Perhaps if you're meditating, you're dampening this, right? Don't worry. Life is suffering, but you know, to focus on things that you can control rather than the things that you can't control, right? So that's sort of the general structure of the account here. Of course, I want to emphasize, it's not a two-component account. There's a whole bunch of other stuff going on subcortically that's feeding into the limbic system here with evaluations of different states. So, you know, amygdala is sort of very active in conditions where fear is there, for instance. And so this is all part of a much larger system where the general idea that I'm trying to put forward here is that suffering is a situation where there's no stable state. The system can't find a resolution to whatever the problem is, whether it's a physical pain or an emotional pain, grief. And think about grief, what do you do to make it go away? Right? And the more you try to make it go away, the more you're learning that whatever you're trying is not working, right? And so you can get into this kind of, you know, real kind of suffering. So to put that a little bit more specifically then, suffering could be thought of as related to some sort of condition of control or non-control in particular over some situation that's producing these negative affect signals. And in particular, it's going to arise, in my view, in cases where whatever agency you have, whatever you're trying, right, seems not to be working, and you're not learning anything about how to control this thing. So, a rough sketch of a model here, a very crude notion of a model, is that somehow the amount of suffering is going to be proportional to the intensity of the negative affect. So the more painful it is, right, the higher the suffering. But it's also going to be crossed with the perceived lack of control. What you're doing here, is it getting rid of it? Do you have any options to get rid of it? I'll say something about the bike racers at the very end. So when we think about physical pain, what I want to suggest is actually, from an evolutionary perspective, this kind of negative affect, do something about it, oh, that's working, or oh, that's not working, could be a very primitive kind of agent level control mode, so we're at the system level for physical pain, where bodily movement is the main tool that you have to decrease whatever is causing that pain. So, I suffer from a little, like most people my age, a little bit of arthritis, and particularly in my thumbs. Sometimes all I have to do is return the thumbs to kind of a relaxed position, and the pain goes away. I don't think I'm suffering, right? But the same amount of pain where no matter where I put the thumb, right, turns out to be a lot more annoying, right, in various ways, right? Then that's where I think maybe I should go see a doctor, and then the weather changes and I feel better again, so I don't go see the doctor. Nevertheless, if we think about this in kind of this context, finding a position at which you are not anymore getting this noxious stimulus firing it seems to be quite a basic protective aspect of the body. Now, if I'm going to restate the thesis a little bit more carefully, but again, perhaps not as precisely as we might ultimately want it to be, but I take it to be an empirical question, how to work this out in detail. Suffering would be an inverse function of the predicted or anticipated decrease in negative affect due to self-agency. And that's why grief is so bad. You can't do anything about it, right? Certain kinds of physical pains you can. In the bike race, I said I was going to hold this for the end, but in the bike race, you could quit, but think of the shame, right? So you are stuck in this thing where this is just nasty, but right? I can't be seen as a quitter, right? There's no way out other than just going through it. There is an end in sight, and that's going to be important in thinking about the difference between human suffering and animal suffering. So the fact that you know that at some point it's going to go away might help, but even the patients in the colonoscopy know it's going to end at some point, right? That we still get variations in judgment of suffering despite that fact. So we might think that anticipation of these effects of action upon this affective state is a kind of core cognitive competency in animals that arguably is embellished. This word hypertrophic means like really highly developed in humans. We have such long temporal windows. We can think of all kinds of ways to make things unpleasant for ourselves and for others, such as organizing nasty bike races, right? There's a whole set of dimensions there, but I'll say a bit more about why that doesn't mean that human suffering is always going to be worse than animal suffering when we get a little further on. So the idea is that this account potentially integrates findings in several domains. So social regulation of behavior, voluntary submission to pain, like why do people go in for this, right? The power of meditation and so on, I already hinted at several of those. And just to sort of push this embodied perspective again of sort of the evolutionary origins, you can think of it as a negative reinforcement. The pain is a negative reinforcement signal, right, that promotes healing. Well, the release of the pain is the negative reinforcer, right? That's what I should say to be careful here. And I think it's quite telling. This is actually an old archaeological specimen, but it's in what we recognize as the fetal position, right? There's sort of this one position that you gravitate to when you're in absolutely intense pain that nothing else has any chance of removing. That's sort of like that's the final option, and it doesn't always work. So less bothersome pains have multiple positional solutions, right? But the more bothersome ones have fewer, right? The fetal position being sort of the last option there. But I would argue that the amount of suffering is not so much related to the level of pain per se, although it's a component of it, but related to this inability to find a position that is seemingly reducing it. And that's a learning task, right? And we've already heard that the ACC is involved in learning. So if we think about what might be going on here, Kahneman's story, that it's the average of the peak and the amount just before, that's really just what in modeling terminology is sometimes called a phenomenal model. That just redescribes the finding in a certain way, right? So there's nothing wrong with saying that it conforms to that rule. It just doesn't tell you anything about the mechanism, right? And if we're interested in something like a process model, then what I want to suggest is that subjects in this colonoscopy actually have a very limited range of options. You can't say, hang on, doc, I want to get into the fetal position, right? That's not an option for you, right? So they're intrinsic. So really, they're throwing back on psychological. Can you self-distract? Can you think about the fact that this is going to end sometime, right? And my suggestion here is that with this variability in the intensity, sometimes whatever you're doing is going to seem as if it's working, all right? All right? So the system is going to be learning that whatever you're doing is correlating with, right, this like general downward slope here, gentler downward slope. And so the idea there then is there's less suffering here because you've got a strategy that seems to be bringing down this race condition between these two other parts, right? And on the other hand, this patient, right, very little seemed to be working, and then it was over. Right? So it was just before it's over, the system was in sort of overdrive, trying to figure out how to make this thing seem better, right? Regardless of whether or not the agency was actually implicated in that change, it could have been the doctor moving the equipment around, right? That's causing these peaks and valleys in the perceived level of unpleasantness at any given moment. So the claim is that when you've got humans employing these psychological strategies, it does not have to be that their agency is actually what's making it happen. It just has to seem like it is. So the better end, the right hand there, produces what's perhaps spurious evidence that the strategy that you're using is working. Some kind of cognition of control amounts to less suffering in this case. All right, so now I get into some territory that where I know there's a bit of controversy. So how do we think about ACC function here? And so the older views of this was that the ACC is especially active when there's some kind of response conflict prior to action. And there was a competing theory that said the ACC is most active when there's a detection of some discrepancy between the actual and intended outcome. So you're, in a sense, predicting some outcome, it didn't happen. That discrepancy makes the ACC take note, and that's post-action, right? So there's a sort of pre-action theory of what the ACC is doing and a post-action theory. In 2005, Brown and Braver suggested that these two things could actually be unified under a general account here that that time they called learned anticipation of error likelihood in context. So what the system is doing is not just whether it's working, but whether or not what it's doing is likely to produce an error in prediction of some kind in the context, right? And this pulls these two things together. Now, this is where this turns out, of course, like all of these things, to have some controversy. So here's a paper where Professor Wager, did I say that correctly, Tor? Wager, sorry, I got that right. Right, sorry. I knew it wasn't wager, but right. Professor Wager has been involved in actually challenging the particular account that Brown and others give on the grounds that their original experiments could be accounted for just in terms of some timing issues, duration of the conditions in the experiment, and then there's been a sort of nice back and forth between them about how to think about this, with Josh Brown, who I knew from IU, taking the position in this paper that there's really no conflict between these two. Both can be fit into a common model. Josh Brown's a mathematical modeler, so he's very good at sort of coming up with some mathematical structure which will accommodate the varying results, and I'll be interested here about that. But for my purposes, I'm not going to pin too much on any particular account, but I'm trying to suggest that something in this ballpark about the way in which planning and evaluation of plans and success in that might be relevant to thinking about suffering. And if the ACC story is slightly more complicated than the one I've given so far, or the one that they give, that will be interesting information. So I'm not going to go through these data. It would take a little bit too long for me to do this. But Brown and Braver's view is that the ACC, as I said, is involved in anticipating error likelihood. And so how likely are you to be wrong about whether or not this action is going to produce what you want it to produce? And I'm just a couple of short quotes here just to get the flavor of their model. So again, this is a sort of mathematized model. I'm giving you a verbal description of it. But the ACC response to a given task condition will be proportional to the perceived likelihood of an error. So your ACC is going to be really active when you're really unsure that what you're doing is actually going to produce the desired outcome. And then conflict and error detection, those two older theories, are accounted for then as special cases within this, they argue. So where you've got two things that neither of them seem very likely to produce what you want, right? That you're going to get the conflict case prior, but then also when you have found that you were expecting something to happen and you got a big error signal, it didn't happen, you'll get also ACC activation in that case, because the system's trying to learn its own prediction success on their view. There's as always, there's a lot of further work. I mean, it's hard enough keeping up with the philosophy of science literature, let alone the philosophy literature, and the neuroscience literature is even bigger and by orders of magnitude. But there's again some interesting related work here, which I'll just mention briefly. So this is a study from 2011 on the integration of negative affect, pain, and cognitive control. So this kind of feeds into it's some kind of assessment of how well what you're trying to do is working. I'll just briefly read a couple of sentences here. It's been argued that emotion, pain, and cognitive control are functionally segregated in distinct subdivisions of the cingulate cortex, but recent observations encourage a fundamentally different view. So just to skip, negative affect, pain, and cognitive control activate an overlapping region of dorsal cingulate, the anterior mid-cingulate cortex, and studies reveal that this part of the cingulate cortex constitutes a hub where information about reinforcers, right? So Dawkins is not far off to be talking about reinforcers, but we're putting this in a more neural context, can be linked to motor centers responsible for expressing affect and executing goal-directed behavior. So there's a very tight sort of conditions under which there's very tight coupling between these systems that produces then judgments about pain. And I would say not just pain, its intensity, but suffering about an entire experience. So again, just to sort of apply this, make that last comment a little bit more concrete, then the anticipated error in the context of pain or any other negative affect states such as grief is going to be roughly equivalent to the likelihood that actions fail to reduce the intensity of that state. And so suffering on this view then is going to be some kind of learned high error likelihood across all available actions. You're just anticipating that nothing you can do will make this better. So again, if we go back to the bike races, sure, they could quit and they'd stop feeling the physical pain, but they're gonna have some other kind of shame, or they might lose their jobs. All of these other potential negative outcomes are there, and no matter what they do, they're stuck with it, and that's what makes it, just whatever the level of pain is, generally a real kind of suffering. I would suggest there. I'm just going to go through this quite quickly. I mean, again, I'm trying to emphasize that we can't look at any part of the anatomy and say it's doing just this one thing. So, it's implicated in attention, but I think that's also related to anticipation. It's related to anxiety, but the exact way in which it is complicated. I've already mentioned the way in which it seems to be related to kind of mindfulness and meditation practices as a way of reducing anxiety. There's, again, anatomical evidence of sort of these neurons that provide very fast connections between the relevant areas that I'm talking about here. So we know there are pathways that could support this kind of story. So back to the animal ethics, right? How do we think about this? Well, in this sense then, pain, that is something that is transiently uncomfortable or distressing, wouldn't automatically count as a high level of suffering on this account. So in this sense, pain is inevitable, but suffering is optional, right? So when we discuss animal welfare and just treat suffering as kind of an intense kind of pain, I think we're probably not capturing the full dynamics of the actual animal systems, let alone the human ones. Also, though, that means that if you are causing pain to an animal in a situation where it doesn't have any way to physically escape it, that is going to produce a kind of suffering. So if we go back to the rats and the place preference conditioning, you're shocking a rat, it can easily move to the other part of the chamber where it's not getting shocked. Okay, the shocks are not that, they're unpleasant, but they're not that unpleasant. And if you were to be shocked in the same way the rat is, you would think it's much less bad than getting a quick jolt from a 110 outlet, right? It's like, it's noticeable. You would have that withdrawal reflex. You wouldn't necessarily want to repeat it, but you wouldn't say, oh, that was terrible, I'd never want to have that again. But if you put the animal under constraints, or put the person in the colonoscopy situation where there's no physical escape possible, right? Then in that sense, the suffering is not optional unless the organism has some, in the human case, psychological strategies potentially to deal with it. But how do you get animals to get psychological strategies? Do they even know that it's going to end, right? These are questions that are going to empirically determine depending on the particular animal species that you're thinking about. And so the capacity of different animals to find or learn actions that eliminate pain or other negative reinforcers. So I'm not, I wanted to sort of, again, say part of the distinction between pain and suffering is that suffering is this more general concept that ranges over a whole class of different negative reinforcers. So things that when removed are negative reinforcements, right, will depend on the species and individual characteristics. So what's painful for a dog or a cat might be the same, but whether that is suffering for a dog or a cat might really depend on other facts about dogs and cats, or even about individuals. What about non-mammals? Because everything I've said is so far mammalian. We expect there to be empirically measurable variation in the behavioral bases of this negative affect reduction. I think we expect there to be differences in what I'm calling here, and I've already mentioned it. I used this word before NFTs were a thing, but fungibility of negative affect. So back to the bike racer, right? You could stop that physical pain, just quit, right? But now you've traded it for this non-physical pain, which is the shame, the embarrassment, all these other things, right? So in more complex organisms that you can trade off, you might trade off these different kinds of negative affect, right? And that makes the whole system more complicated and makes certain kinds of suffering more available, as it were, or more possible, in depending on the organism's capabilities. Integration of cognition and affect via learning. So that's going to differ from species to species. I'm just sort of trying to point out places where you could test empirically how individuals differ. The temporal horizons, right? So the person in the bike race might think, another hour of this and I'm going to be on the winner's podium, or I have a good shot at it, right? That understanding of the situation, because of that long time horizon, might make what's going on there, that's a psychological distraction strategy of a sort, right? Just think of the glory. That's available to humans because we have this long time frame and we have all this social structure around other forms of reinforcers, right? That would not be available for other animals necessarily. And then this kind of learnable detachment, sort of in the meditative tradition, is something that might actually make humans able to deal with certain kinds of negative affect states better by bringing down what I've called this race condition, by adopting strategies which just stop you even trying to find a solution to something that you cannot find a solution for, right? Think about something else, right? Concentrate on your breathing, whatever it is. And then, sorry, I skipped ahead a little bit earlier. I was thinking this slide was the one up next, but the sort of the non-mammalian. So what about birds? So there's been a whole bunch of really interesting work in the last 15 years or so, remapping what's going on in bird brains. And it turns out to be not in the strict anatomical sense, but in the network configuration sense, counterparts to many of the areas that I have been talking about here in the avian brain. They're just called different things because they're actually not homologous in the evolutionary sense. So the CDL, or the corticoid dorsolateris in the bird, is a further hub of the pigeon connectome, has a similar connectivity pattern to the cingulate cortex, which is also a hub in the connectomes, as we've seen, of humans, macaques, and cats, mammalian. So the argument here is that you could find topologically similar structures in non-mammalian species and see that here the CDL is classified as part of the limbic system, as is the ACC in mammals, right? So functionally, this thing might be doing a very similar job. It's an empirical question, how similar that job is, or jobs are, to be really careful about that, in the bird brain versus the mammalian brain. So again, we open up a kind of empirical approach to understanding how this trade-off between planning and evaluation of those plans feeds into a learning system. We're not just saying it's in the ACC. We can understand how other configured organisms might have similar structure. So this is my last slide. And so, here were the goals. And so I hope that I've satisfied these goals. That I wanted to offer an account of suffering that distinguishes it from pain, but makes clear that there's a very strong connection, right? I hope to have shown you that it's grounded in some of the behavioral science and some of the functional neuroanatomy, that it could be empirically investigated in humans and non-human animals. Again, putting aside the question of whether anybody, I might be a zombie as far as I know, and certainly as far as you know. So, these sort of philosophical questions about how do we know that anything's really conscious, I think we set that aside. What we're looking for is sort of overall functional structural similarity, right? And that relates to our intuitive understanding of suffering. I've certainly tried to illustrate it with lots of intuitive cases, such as the biking. But that's a polysemic term. I'm not trying to figure out all the different ways in which people do talk about suffering. I'm just trying to say, here's a way to think about suffering that is not just pain, right? But lets us actually think more seriously about whether something is really awful for an animal or a human being. Right. So thank you very much. And do you want me to just field my own questions? Yeah, I'm super happy to do that. So, yeah.
Yeah, I wonder, I think this is what you were saying in your account, but it seems like if we have a default level of our perception of our own agency, if we have sort of like a baseline level of perception of our own agency, where, for example, if someone experiences low levels of agency for an extended amount of time, maybe at first they'll experience very low agency, but they'll slowly adjust to a sort of baseline perception of agency. So like, and I think we see this in lots of other sort of internal models where they adjust back to a baseline even after periods of deprivation or like periods of excess. So I wonder if what really matters in suffering is not just how much you can reduce your negative affect with your voluntary actions, but the difference between how much you can, like between your prediction of how much you expect to be able to reduce your negative affect with your voluntary actions based on your normal expectation of how much agency you have and how much you actually can, or how much you perceive yourself as actually doing that.
Yeah, good. So that's a, sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
Oh yeah, I just wanted to like, is that what you were aiming for?
No, I think, yes, so it's a great question, but a complicated question, and so let me try to tug on a couple of the pieces of it. So what you said just before that last comment was exactly right. So I tended in the talk to sort of just talk about whether or not the action is being successful in reducing the pain, but you correctly said that there's something more, which is predicting whether or not you were right about that action, right? And that I take to be very much at the core of the Brown and Braver account. So it's kind of this second order learning about the effectiveness of strategies rather than just a first order response to an effective strategy or not, right? The other part of your question, which is really interesting, and I haven't, maybe I need to know more about sort of the way in which experience of agency recalibrates in the way that you were talking about, but I think there's something essentially right there in that you could be in a situation where it seems like you have no ability to control something that's happening, this pain that you're feeling, but then you could actually stumble across something that not just is appearing to make your prediction of the outcome better, but actually is making your prediction of the outcome better. So in the Kahneman colonoscopy study, right, you're not going through that, hopefully you're not going through that as many times that you could learn whether or not what seemed to be working in the first colonoscopy is also working in the second, right? You don't have enough exposure to that. But if you were doing something repetitive, right, maybe the bike racing is a good example here again. You could find 3 events at the Hell of the North, the Paris-Roubaix race, it's sort of just absolutely miserable. But then you actually find some strategy from your experience of more and more races that okay, I felt like this before, and when I pushed harder, it actually went away, right? And so you learn something about the unreliability of that signal as a predictor of whether or not this thing is going to end, and you've also now got a different strategy, perhaps, which has got a higher predictivity, I guess, if that's a word for that. So does that get at your idea of like the agency, sort of perception of one's own agency can shift, right, during different experiences? I think that's interesting.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah.
Sorry, just to follow up, do you think that this same like predictive processing sort of framework of suffering, I wonder what you would think about applying it to machines or computational systems that have these same, like maybe a similar topological or network structure that evaluates like agency and levels of pain and whether that means that machines can suffer?
So I tend to think of any actual extant computer systems that we have from AI, even the very biggest sort of artificial neural networks that we have, as being to the brain a bit like I don't know if this example's timely but also not great, but as a Lego bridge is to a real bridge, right? In other words, you can sort of squint at it and see these structural similarities, but only at some level of abstraction. That means that what you've got in the model is not really fit for purpose, right? You shouldn't drive over a Lego bridge any more than you should drive over certain Pittsburgh bridges, I guess, right? So there's a notion here of being fit for purpose that I'm appealing to, where I think, yeah, a lot of our neural network models are fit for very narrow purposes, but they're not fit for actually, and this is the problem of artificial general intelligence all over, they're not fit for real autonomous agency in a real world, right? They're extremely narrow systems. And so if you look at that and go, well, it's got the same structure as a rat, you're kind of squinting at it and looking at a Lego bridge going, well, maybe I could drive my bus across that, right? And so don't get me wrong, I don't think that there's any ultimate story about machines not ever being able to have the kind of intelligence that or cognitive capacities that we see in actual biological systems. I just think that there's a long way to go given the quite crude models that we have. Even the very big models still treat individual neurons as basically some threshold input-output devices, and real neurons are way, way, way more complicated than that and have way, way more ways of impinging on the activity of surrounding neurons. It's not just a single weighted transfer of some value, right? And the interesting modeling question is how far can you go with those simplified models? Modeling is always a simplification, and that's what makes it valuable and instructive to us. Good, yeah.
Disclaimer, Dr. Ron, I'm a first-year student here, so I don't have much knowledge on the topic. But I was just curious when you talk about this, especially in terms of activity about, I'd say like internal monologue in a way. I don't know if you understand what I'm talking about, but relative to like the bike race, for example, maybe a coping strategy for suffering would be like, let's say that the biker's here and the finish line is here. Maybe a model for which like the biker could like pass through each stage is like to maybe look at like a light pole and say, oh, I'm gonna pass through here, I'm gonna pass through here.
Yeah.
I was curious, and I was gonna ask, do we see any sort of brain activity in not only areas implying like this cognitive control of behavior in terms of like language inside the brain, but also how it's related to social cognition, where you talked about the idea of like the glory and the honor of winning the race. Like, do we see those activities occurring when we're also talking about like control of suffering?
Yeah, so you're a freshman, great. So you've got 3 more years and a bit to sort of actually go after these questions, because here I am, not a neuroscientist, certainly not somebody who has a lab who can test these sorts of questions empirically. And of course, we have all sorts of measurement problems when it comes to, you can't put fMRI onto a cyclist, right? And you can't even put them in a condition where they're doing something that requires physical exertion. You can have them watch videos of people going through it, right? But you can't do anything more sophisticated than that. So there's a huge gap between what we would like to do and what we can do. And so I think the answer to a lot of your questions is we actually really don't quite know how to measure those things yet. But I think with sufficient cleverness, we can find ways of getting into issues of what kinds of strategies do people have for, I'm just spitballing here, but I can imagine a study where you find out from people what kinds of strategies they think they have for dealing with certain kinds of unpleasant situations, and then look to see when they're in similar unpleasant situations. But again, because of human subject protection and so on, you can't put them in really unpleasant situations, right? But you could sort of try to see whether the strategies that they say were available to them correlate in any way with differences in what you might see. Now, that's sort of a very naive first sketch of how one might go about this, but that's the kind of thing one might imagine doing here. Right? So how much You know, if somebody like says, I mean, I actually really like your example of getting to the next pole because I use that myself. Right, good. Yeah, right. Yeah, don't think about how long you're going to be here. Just think about getting to that thing, right? And that's actually a very good general strategy for all sorts of tasks, right? Don't worry about finishing the paper. Write the next paragraph, right? Write 500 words today and 500 words tomorrow, right? Don't sit down and think, oh my goodness, how am I going to write 10,000 words? Yeah, that's right. So these are strategies for sort of bringing down the worry about planning this big thing that you have no idea of where your prediction about your, you know, the likelihood of failure here, your predictions on it seem really uncertain, right? If I do this, am I going to get there, right? Whereas you take these little bits, then your confidence in the likelihood of the prediction goes up considerably, especially based on experiences that you've had.
And that's where we could see some of this this activity within the ACC in terms of like in terms of planning and evaluating strategies for dealing with suffering.
Yeah, and you could teach people strategies and see how that, right, so here's another sort of idea for a study, right? Teach people different strategies and have a control group where they haven't been taught those strategies and see what kinds of differences you get. Again, the devil's in the details, but I think thinking through this in this more complicated sort of systems level way is much better than saying, well, you know, put morphine into the ACC and the rat doesn't, or the person doesn't say the pain bothers them anymore. That's all good science, don't get me wrong, but it's not getting at the full complexity of the system and what it's doing.
Yeah, and my in a brief follow-up question, just about the idea of the fetal position as kind of as one of these ways of coping with stress, or excuse me, coping with suffering. I'm curious how you found research about that and whether we can like see if it's kind of some behavior that's kind of intrinsic to humans, or if it's something that's a little bit more complicated than that.
Yeah, so some portion of what I was doing in this talk is speculative, and some portion of it is sort of grounded in information that I have. So from the animal literature, there's a long-studied phenomenon known as learned helplessness, right? Which actually involves some pretty unpleasant experiments. I mean, I think that some of the animals in there, at least initially, were really suffering. Now, when a dog gets to the point of learned helplessness and seems willing to go into this chamber for the nth time, because this is some of the original work on this was done at University of Colorado by Meyer, I believe. But there were other people as well. You know, they would put dogs in these situations where they're just getting electric shocks or whatever all the time and they can't get out. And then they would find that after multiple instances of this, at some point, at least some of the dogs would seem to go very willingly to the chamber. Now, you could argue that what they've acquired, but this is again speculative, is some coping strategy that's based on experience that this thing will end. So maybe there's some potential for getting the right kind of temporal window on the experience. But again, that's speculative, but it does sort of open the door to looking at what would be going on differently. In those days, nobody did MRI with dogs, or certainly not fMRI with dogs. There are, in fact, people doing fMRI with dogs these days, too. I'm not saying you should do learned helplessness experiments with dogs, though, but I think sort of trying to get at whether part of what happens in a particular situation is one where the animal figures out a strategy for dealing with something unpleasant would be a really interesting question.
I have done here how suffering relates to this concept. The concept and the experiments in learned helplessness. So that answers
Excellent. Good.
Thank you so much.
Good, great. Yeah.
Me?
Yes, please.
Oh yeah, so this seems to be, it's super interesting, thanks. I sort of was trying to tease apart two different elements, right? So the analysis you give of suffering, if I found it right, you know, has to do with the perception of pain and also this sort of perceived ability to use one's agency to alleviate it. And some of the cases seem to involve that, and some, there's also this like understanding of when it's going to end, right, or that it will end, or that it will end soon, just a sort of time frame. So there seems to be a sort of agency component and a time frame component, at least in some of the cases. And I was just wondering, what, if there's empirical work that can tease these apart. It wasn't clear to me in the colonoscopy part. Example, if there's really a sort of observation of their own agency of coping strategies or not, for example. So if there's any empirical work that teases them apart, and also if there's any sort of normative reason for wanting to identify suffering with this perceived ineffectuality of your own agency and relieving it, rather than with just this perceived, hang on, I'm going to stop.
Yeah, yeah, good. So three things I want to say at once, and I can't say them all at once. So, and I may not remember all three, but in terms of the thinking about the role of the time window looking ahead here, one suggestion is sort of bring that back into the fold of the rest of the story, and I think it's one that has come up implicitly, at least in some of the answers before and some of the things I said in talk, is that knowing the length of the experience, right, might provide a kind of useful cognitive strategy for dealing with it. So the colonoscopy, you might have been told by the doctor, well, this could, we could be out of here in 7 minutes, or it might take an hour. You don't know how long this is going to go on, right? That's a very different situation even than the dog in the learned helplessness experiment, where its entire experience has always been, 5 minutes in here or 10 minutes in here, whatever it was, right? It's had typically those experiments were not done, at least, with variable amounts of exposure, right? So there was an opportunity for the animals to develop some kind of temporal-based expectation. But that's, entirely speculative, again, about that particular case. So temporal window and knowledge of the temporal window within which this experience is confined is, I think, one route into a kind of coping strategy, right? But I also think that it's a source, potentially, of other, we'll go back to the sort of fungibility point, right? So the whole point about, Hincapie might be thinking, I've only got an hour to go to the end, but what if actually I'm not going to win again, right? It's my 10th time in this damn race, and I've never done better than second, right? Shouldn't I just quit and stop this pointless pain right now? But then, what are the next weeks or months going to be like around my teammates if they see me quit like this, right? He might be riding along thinking, I hope I get a flat tire. I hope I get a flat tire. Then I can quit and blame the bike, right? So I think that it's not just knowledge of the duration of the experience, although that can play a role. It's also then this sort of capacity to think about how one's actions are playing a role in not just what's going to happen in the next hour, but what's going to happen in the next days or weeks. That then introduces more possibilities. It makes it harder to get out of this situation. And that makes the suffering correspondingly greater, because stopping writing will stop the pain right now, but you've got all of that other stuff to deal with. It's going to go on for much, much longer. And then the third thing, I think this is the third thing, was, again, I tend to go back and forth when I'm talking about this between learning that what you're doing is working, but really it's, right, learning how reliable you are about predicting whether or not it's going to work, right? And different temporal horizons come with different assessments of the reliability of your predictions. So you can predict right now that if you stop pedaling, that awful pain in your body is going to subside very, very quickly. But then it's completely unpredictable what is going to happen to you because you quit, right? Are you going to lose your job? Or is your coworkers going to disrespect you? There's all this other stuff where there's a huge amount of the likelihood of prediction error about that stuff is really high, right? And if it weren't so high, maybe if you had really good predictions about that stuff, that would completely change the nature of the assessment of the choices that are going on. And so I think it's, it's easy to say it's complicated, but I hope that it's complicated in a way that is not hopeless to try to tease these things apart and think about. I mean, I'm spinning off examples from bike racing, but sort of to think about how one might design experiments with humans where, again, going back to the idea, you might teach strategies, you might find out what strategies they already have, you might put them in situations where they could stop some physical pain, but they're going to have some social costs for doing so, right? You can manipulate how likely it is that that social cost will be incurred, right? So how good is, what's the prediction error likelihood here, right? All of that could be experimented within the right, manipulated within the right experimental framework, it seems to me. So yeah, I don't have the data on that. I don't have the means to do the experiments myself, but I hope to sort of clear the kind of conceptual space for that sort of work to be thought about, at least, if not done. Good. Yeah.
I guess it's kind of a quick question, I think, but just about like how ambitious the project is, and like whether or not you think you're giving a sort of like complete account of suffering, or whether or not you've just pointed to a feature that's relevant for suffering. So like the kind of part of this worry arose by thinking like, in the at least like the slight model that you gave, it's multiplicative. So in cases where you really do have control over it, it shouldn't be counted as suffering at all, even if you're experiencing pain. But then I'm just imagining, I don't know, like I put my hand in a fire, leave it there, and I know exactly, or I don't know, I mean, it seems like obvious that if I just really do leave my hand, even though I know I have complete control, I am suffering. Even though, right, I could take it out, or it's exposed like cold water. I agree that it would be worse or more suffering if I really couldn't control it, but it doesn't seem to me that by me having control over it, ceases to be suffering whatsoever.
Yeah, so two-part response to that. I mean, to the first part, you're working with some conception of what suffering really is, and maybe I've only got a part of it. I don't know what suffering really is, right? And part of the way I tried to set this up is I'm not trying to do conceptual analysis of some pre-existing concept. I'm really trying to say, look, here's something that's in the ballpark of what we talk about when we're talking about suffering that seems to apply to a lot of the cases. And in that sense, it's more of a conceptual engineering project of saying, here's a concept we could work with that seems also to be ethically relevant, grounded in behavior and neuroanatomy. So I sort of want to shift the terms of that debate. Now, the other point is also one though that I take. Maybe I should take the first one more seriously, but the other point is one that I do take really quite seriously as well. So I think, you put your hand in the fire. Your prediction. The likelihood of prediction that your prediction that it's going to hurt like hell is really, that you're wrong about it going to hurt like hell is really low probability. You're wrong about that, right? But I also, I suppose, and maybe, I'm coming back again to sort of an issue of philosophical methodology. I sort of want to know, why is this person holding their hand in the fire, right? It's sort of like, why is this guy... I mean, most of us would have quit a long time ago. Why is this guy keeping going, right? So I think for me to have a proper answer to that story, I need to know more than, but what's motivating to endure this if it's not the thought that there's something worse? So now he's actually got something where there's some amount of pain and he really doesn't have some amount of distress or not negative affect, to put it more broadly, that he really doesn't have a strategy for getting rid of. It's either the burn or, his daughter's going to be shot by the madman next door, right? These are, and the grief that will ensue from that, right? So you got to tell me a better story than that one for me to say whether or not this account can accommodate the
I
case.
actually have, I didn't want to bring it up, it's like in my own, like, my feelings of most suffering are just like, I don't know, long trail runs that really are terrible. I'm not an elite athlete in any way. I have complete control over stopping and making the thing go away.
Mhm.
I feel deeply like I'm suffering, and there's no shame in quitting. Like people, if anything, people would prefer me to, I think, stop running, right? Like I feel like everybody would be happier, maybe including myself if I do it. It feels like I have complete control. There I am suffering. That's the kind of example that
Yeah.
pushed me to think like, you really, why not just say that? I mean, I agree that it would still be worse. I'd still be suffering more if someone were making it so I didn't control it. But
I mean, fair enough. You might think that there's no social, what you're experiencing there is not fungible towards some kind of social disapprobation, right? But you set yourself the goal of finishing this race. You're going to have to live with yourself after the race as well, right? And what kind of person actually signs up for that kind of thing if they don't really have the goal and then don't know that they're going to be really disappointed if they don't push through this, right? So again, I would say, yes, you're right. It may be that your friends and relatives actually wish you quit because then they could go home, right? Right? But that's not the only thing. That's not the only thing in the space here, right? And maybe that's another kind of uniquely human sort of aspect to this is we have our own kind of sense of what it is that makes us who we are, and my quitting in a race is not the kind of person I want to be. Right? I'm going to have to live with myself after that. Why do you sign up for those awful races?
I was just thinking about like running.
Events. I don't mean races. Yeah, but yeah. You sign up for things that most people think would be, they'd much rather be sitting on the couch watching the TV than doing what you're doing, right? Something is driving you there, and if it's not the approbation of the approval of others, or
Yeah.
right,
So
what is it?
I guess the worry I have, I think, in the back of my mind is like, what would be evidence against this view? Like, is there any case in which someone could, or some sentient thing could be?
There are no counterexamples to my view because I intend that there be none, right? No, look, so one question is, what would be I think, again, you're engaged in a kind of philosophical approach that I'm not engaged in here, right? So I want to say this whole view could be shot out of the water if you show me that the nothing in the brain or the system as a whole and the interaction among its parts corresponds to the components. And whether it's multiplicative or additive or some other function, I probably just should have put an F in the two terms inside parentheses, right? I really don't care. I said cross, I didn't say times, it's somehow crossed with it, right? There's some sort of product between the two. But when the model is properly specified, right? I would argue in more mathematical terms as well at some level, but also anatomically, there's lots of things that could just cause me to reject this theory, right? Coming up with some thought experiment, some person who, has total control over everything, but still is suffering is, okay, maybe there even could be such a person in my story, but again, this is not supposed to be an analysis, right? A set of necessary and sufficient conditions for suffering. It's supposed to be an empirically workable concept that is in the ballpark of whatever it is that you think suffering is. Right?
So, trying to understand a little more about what agency amounts to in this picture, and here's an experiment. So, at least some sense of agency seems to be dependent on parietal efferent copy, like a comparator basically between your plan and whether the plan turns out the way you want. And I wonder if you get somebody who has like parietal lesion or you TMS them in one condition where you're disrupting this comparator circuit and disrupting the sense of agency. And then ask, like, if you're suffering more this time or that time. Maybe that's a way to test it, but it seems like, I don't know, what would you say? Suppose that didn't work. Would that,
So the outcome would be, we've disrupted the comparator,
Yeah.
but
there's no difference in the
rated
reports of
suffering.
So
Yeah.
like one problem, or I wouldn't say it, one difficulty in doing this empirically is how do you measure suffering?
Right.
I mean, it's hard enough, I think, to measure pain, but,
Mhm.
and so the only way I can imagine really getting data that you might believe is intrapersonally, like just get the same subject to do different conditions
Mhm.
where you're manipulating agency, but I just wonder like how broad, what is agency such that it figures in this story, and would that be a test?
Yes, so maybe it helps to think about the colonoscopy case again here. Not because I want to think about colonoscopies, but because I think it's got perhaps a way into this. So if we do your TMS study, we disrupt some part of the system that's the comparator, but we find that there's still, nevertheless, sorry, two parts to this answer. So one part is the suffering is measured by the global evaluation. The pain is measured by the moment by moment is one way to operationalize that for the purposes of this experiment, right? How intense is this right now? How willing would you be to go through that whole thing again, right? And so now the thing is, could you disrupt the comparator in some way and still show that that you get the better end effect, or that it disrupts the better end effect? Would that do it? So remember that in the colonoscopy, it doesn't depend on the actual agency of the individual. It depends on the perceived agency from their own
Right,
standpoint.
I mean, one other test that might be simpler is to just give the same pain stimuli, but in one, like, in the middle part, so the end, I don't know how much the end is really the important part of the better end, but I thought it was sort of the end.
It's
So
the,
what if
yeah.
you have, sort of a ramping up over time, so your pain actually gets worse, even though the total pain is the same versus the pain goes down, such that the slope is in the right direction for it to be a look, to convince yourself you've learned something as opposed to, maybe being, or something random versus the slope, but.
Yeah. So again, it's a really interesting set of issues, but I mean, if we sort of think about these two patients here, even if in the middle here, it might have seemed to them that something was working, they're going to then have learned that when it spikes up again, try that same thing. Oh, it's not working, right? Whereas here, it seems that something's working. The spike up, it works. Spikes up, not quite so high, it still works. Spikes up again, still works, right? There's a kind of, they're gaining confidence in the predictability of that strategy, even if the strategy actually has nothing to do with the actual rate intensity. It might have everything to do with the clumsiness of the proctologist.
Oh, so, I'm sorry, I read that, I thought that what mattered was, sort of the slope from the peak in patient
No.
B down, not the,
It's just the average of these 2 points. So it's the average of the peak and the average of just before, with the value just before. So it's not the overall slope, it's the mean between that high and,
no, but that's
this
the
here.
Feynman rule, that's not the mechanism.
Oh, sorry, okay, sorry, I misunderstood the question.
Yeah, so the mechanistic explanation is that you have you've convinced yourself that something you are doing
Mm-hmm.
is actually improving the pain, as opposed to the pain is getting better, it has nothing to do with you doing anything.
Right.
Can you convince a subject that they are not controlling what's going on at all?
Yeah, and would they then still prefer this even, yeah, good. Now we're on the same page, and I've had that question before. And this is a work in progress, and that's one of those questions that I don't think I have a really great answer to, and I'm still trying to think it through. But right, so you could imagine all kinds of rubber hand illusion type like setups, right, where you know that it's not your agency involved here, but it's related to something that's happening in some sensations that you're getting. It would be right, and so the question is, what if you find out that that Kahneman's rule still works in cases where you know that you're actually not controlling this thing, but it has this profile? And I skipped over something earlier on. Actually, it's one of those areas where it's sort of trying to get clear on whether or not this has to be conscious cognition of control or some implicit process, right? And so it could well be that cognitively you know that, and calling it cognitive control gets problematic here. I debated taking the word cognitive out, but sort of that's the anchor that we start with. So that's why I said it's paradigmatically perhaps conscious, but in fact there might be cases where these are implicit processes that are involved, right? So yeah, I think you might be able to contrive cases where somebody in some sense knows, but the illusion is powerful enough that it overcomes what they know at a cognitive level about their control of the situation. The implicit system still going, that's working, right? So I really do need to clean that. I mean, I need to think that through a little bit more systematically, but that's the general direction I'm tempted to go with that question. So I look forward to talking about that one more.
We will have time, unless anybody wants to ask another question.
I haven't thought, but I probably shared a dinner for overtime.
Sorry, just one, sort of a follow-up to Professor Thomason's question about the normative component of suffering concepts. I think that your view sort of corresponds a lot to Nietzsche's view of suffering, which is that agency and like what we now call self-efficacy is very important for suffering. But I wonder, he also talks a lot about how our suffering concepts are sort of that actively cause suffering. And so I wonder if you sort of say that like these philosophical concerns with concepts and like the normative role of concepts may not matter as much as the role of the suffering concept in our best empirical theory of the world and of the brain. But I wonder if maybe these suffering concepts matter a lot, and normative concerns like our suffering concept should include all the kinds of moral agents that we want to include as sufferers, and also that our account of suffering should not actively be causing us more suffering. Like for example, Nietzsche has the critique that potentially having a concept of suffering is something that should not be a part of life, or that is not a part of a meaningful life, or is that an argument against life that actually produces more suffering than we would otherwise have if we had a concept of suffering as a good part of a meaningful and good life. So yeah, I wonder how you think those normative components play into the theory.
So I'm so far from being an expert on Nietzsche that I can't even measure the distance, but I think it's interesting in the following regard, because in comparison to the Buddhist tradition, where there are ways of where it's, I mean, I can't speak to the normative dimension of this necessarily, but the idea that once you've got a concept of suffering, it's something that might not even make life worth living is completely antithetical to, I think, the way the Buddhist tradition would think about that, right? Yeah, suffering is part of life, but you can reduce it by stopping striving to control the things that you cannot control, right? So you might even argue that there's sort of a cultural relativism here to Nietzsche's concept of suffering, right? He's got a very, Judeo-Christian Western European concept of, life is here to test us, and if we pass the test, we might get to. I mean, he's fighting against that, but that's the context in which this discussion of suffering is going on, which is very different from somewhere over there. And again, sort of repeat something that I said a bit earlier, is like, yeah, these suffering concepts are polysemic, and when you start going across cultures, they're even more polysemic, right? And I'm not sure that I intend this theory. Well, I'm sure that I don't intend this theory to be true to any of those particular pre-existing concepts in totality, although I think it might interestingly pick up certain aspects of any of those concepts, right? So if there's more, maybe I should pay more attention to Nietzsche on this, because it would sort of be an interesting exercise to think about, well, what does fit that conception from this account and what doesn't fit that conception from this account. But in the end, I'm more interested in saying, look, there's one way to think about suffering is it's not just more pain. This is sort of the original De Grazia thing. It's any inability to get predictive control over the likelihood of removing some unpleasant thing, whether it's pain, grief, fear, anxiety, run the list out as far as you want. So that already distinguishes in a sort of structural way suffering from pain, and also then points to needing to look beyond the so-called pain system to think about the ethical significance of these other kinds of interactions, whether it's in humans or non-human animals. So I hope that makes sense, because again, what I understand about Nietzsche, I just heard from you, so more or less, right? So it's good. That's an interesting question, though.
Okay, great.
Great, thank you very much.
Speaker?
Great, thanks. Great questions, everybody.